The grand stone hall of Arendor had been meticulously decorated for a celebration of ancestral magic, draped in heavy banners of silver silk and glowing with the ferocious, suffocating heat of massive hearth fires. The Winter Solstice Gala was meant to be the most sacred night of the year for the pack. It was a time of unity, a designated night when the sovereign rulers would stand before their people and renew the ancient vows that bound the territory together. The cavernous room was packed tight with thousands of wolves, their excited murmurs echoing off the towering obsidian walls. The scent of roasted venison, spiced honey wine, and fresh pine needles hung thick and heavy in the warm air, mingling with the distinct musk of anticipation. Seren Van Trell stood near the edge of the royal dais, dressed in the heavy, restrictive ceremonial gowns of her station. The velvet fabric pressed against her skin like a physical weight. Her hands were folded quietly over her lower abdomen, intentionally hiding a secret that had only just begun to flutter with life. She kept her head bowed, playing the role of the obedient, silent Luna, waiting for the ceremony to commence. She had spent 3 grueling years pouring her entire soul into this territory. She had memorized the names of every elder, tended to the sick in the lower villages when the brutal winter storms swept through the jagged mountains, and anchored the erratic, terrifying temper of her fated mate, Draven Blackwood. She had endured the whispered insults of the noble class without a single complaint. She had ignored the sneers of those who believed her quiet nature was a sign of weakness, a terminal defect in her wolf. They did not know that her silence was a carefully constructed shield. They did not know that deep beneath her ribs, an ancient, dormant, cosmic lineage hummed, waiting for a safe place to bloom. She had truly believed Arendor was that place. She had thought the man who had claimed her in the dark, who had whispered fierce, desperate promises against her bare skin, was her eternal sanctuary. A sudden, sharp hush fell over the crowded room, slicing through the festive atmosphere like a blade. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a resounding, ancient groan. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly, the flickering firelight casting long, monstrous shadows across the polished stone floor. Draven Blackwood strode down the center aisle. The sovereign of the Arendor pack was a terrifying figure of absolute authority, moving with the lethal, unhurried grace of an apex predator. His broad shoulders were draped in a heavy mantle of black winter wolf fur, and his winter storm eyes were locked dead ahead. He did not look toward the dais. He did not look at the woman who had bound her soul to his, the woman who had spent hours grinding fever bark to heal his battle wounds. His jaw was set in a tight, unyielding line, a mask of cold, impenetrable duty that she had learned to fear over the past few harrowing months. Draven, however, was not alone. The massive crowd parted instantly, bowing their heads in a synchronized wave of submission, revealing the woman walking closely in his imposing shadow. Catherine Sterling moved with a slow, deliberate arrogance, her exquisite crimson silk gown trailing over the polished stone like a smear of fresh blood. The scent of sweet gardenia rolled off her skin, thick and cloying, intentionally masking a faint, underlying odor of political decay that made Seren's stomach twist violently. The manipulative rival had always haunted the edges of the royal court. Catherine had spent months weaving her toxic influence through the High Elders, planting insidious seeds of doubt about the Luna's quiet demeanor and perceived physical frailty. Tonight, she did not walk at the edges in the shadows. She walked directly beside the sovereign, her chin tipped high, a triumphant, sickeningly sweet smile painted across her flawless features. In Catherine's arms, tightly wrapped in rare silver wolf pelts, was a newborn child. The murmurs of the pack grew into a chaotic, frantic buzzing. Seren felt the air leave her lungs in one violent, agonizing rush. The crescent-claiming mark on her wrist, which had always throbbed with a steady, grounding warmth, suddenly flared with a searing, devastating cold. It felt as though a jagged shard of solid ice had been driven directly into her veins, freezing her blood in an instant. She gripped the heavy fabric of her gown, her corlused knuckles turning stark white, fighting the overwhelming, somatic urge to collapse onto the obsidian floor. She watched, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public betrayal. As Draven escorted the ambitious woman up the grand stone steps of the sacred dais, he stopped at the absolute center of the platform, turning his massive frame to face his thousands of subjects. He still did not spare a single, fleeting glance for his true mate standing only a few feet away. Draven raised his hand, and an absolute, suffocating silence slammed down over the grand hall. The heavy tension in the room became a physical weight, pressing relentlessly against the chest of every wolf present. The Alpha reached out, his massive, battle-scarred hands gently taking the bundled infant from Catherine's waiting arms. The gesture was so tender, so completely devoid of his usual cold cruelty, that it sent a fresh, sharp wave of nausea rolling through Seren's gut. The Sovereign turned back to the crowd, raising the newborn high into the flickering, golden light of the massive hearth fires. "I present to you Liam Sterling," Draven's voice boomed, the deep, resonant timbre vibrating through the very foundation of the ancient keep. "The blood of my blood, the future of Arendor." A collective gasp ripped through the gathered noble class. To publicly acknowledge an illegitimate child was a scandal of massive proportions. To present him on the sacred night of the Winter Solstice was an absolute, systemic destruction of the Pack's ancient laws and ancestral traditions. Draven, however, was not finished. He gestured sharply to the High Elder, who stepped forward with visibly trembling hands, carrying a dark velvet cushion. Resting on the plush fabric were the royal heir tokens, ancient bone amulets, and woven direwolf cords that had been strictly passed down through generations of rightful rulers. The elder hesitated, his frightened eyes darting toward the edge of the dais, looking directly at the quiet woman who was legally and spiritually bound to the throne. Draven emitted a low, terrifying rumbling growl, a sound of pure, unadulterated dominance that violently forced the elder to drop his gaze and offer the tokens. The Alpha took the amulets and draped them carefully over the newborn's silver blankets. "Before the ancestors and the moon, I declare this child my true and only successor," he announced, the cruel words striking Seren like physical bruising blows. "From this night forward, Liam is the sole royal heir of this territory. His mother shall be honored as the vessel of our glorious future." The gala was supposed to be a celebration of unity. Instead, it became the moment Seren Vantrell's entire world shattered. The claiming mark on her wrist died completely. The agonizing, searing cold snapped, leaving behind a hollow, cavernous void, an absolute absence where her profound safety and magic should have been. The sheer physical toll of the broken fated bond hit her delicate nervous system like a wave of severe frostbite. Her vision blurred at the edges, the vibrant colors of the grand hall fading into a stark, bleak monochrome of grey and black. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her all at once. She could feel the profound pity radiating from the lower class, the mocking cruelty burning in the stares of the elite nobles, the satisfied, venomous triumph practically glowing from the Mistress standing proudly on the dais. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the defective, wolfless Luna to scream, to fall to her knees, to beg the Sovereign for the pathetic crumbs of her stolen dignity. Seren did not scream. She did not beg. She did not weep for a man who had chosen political convenience and toxic manipulation over the sacred truth of their eternal bond. A strange, eerie calm settled over her mind, blanketing the raw, bleeding agony of the betrayal. She lowered her hands from her hidden abdomen, her posture straightening with a quiet, lethal grace that no one in the room had ever seen her display. The chaotic murmurs died down again, instantly replaced by a tense, suffocating anticipation. Every single breath in the cavernous room seemed perfectly suspended, Seren took a slow, deliberate step forward. The heavy velvet of her ceremonial gown brushed softly against the polished obsidian floor, the quiet rustle echoing as the only sound in the suffocating silence. She did not look at the sovereign. She did not look at the corrupt woman standing triumphantly beside him, nor at the illegitimate child clutching the ancient bone amulets. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the absolute center of the hall, where the massive stone altar stood. The ancient slab of granite was deeply carved with the history of 1,000 fated mates, stained with the blood of sacred sacrifices and the pale ash of countless solstice fires. It was the beating heart of the territory, the physical manifestation of the pack's spiritual power and ancestral lore. As she approached the sacred relic, the massive crowd instinctively parted, stepping back from the intense atmospheric pressure rolling in invisible waves off her fragile frame. Seren stopped before the cold granite slab. She raised her left hand, the flickering hearth light catching the exquisite craftsmanship of the sacred moon ring on her finger. It was the ultimate symbol of her royal authority, a heavy silver relic forged with ancestral magic that physically tied the lunar soul to the very earth of the territory. It had felt like an incredible honor when Draven had slid it onto her trembling hand in the dark. Now it felt like an iron shackle holding her to a decaying, rotting corpse. Without a single word, without a tremble in her calloused fingers, she gripped the thick metal band. She pulled. The ancient metal resisted for a fraction of a second, catching painfully on her knuckle, before sliding free with a sharp, metallic scrape. The physical friction left a harsh red mark on her pale skin, but the emotional release was instantaneous. A heavy, suffocating weight vanished completely from her exhausted shoulders. She held the ceremonial token over the exact center of the stone altar. For one brief, suspended heartbeat, she allowed herself to look up. Her eyes met Draven's. The sovereign's winter storm gaze was suddenly wide, a flicker of genuine confusion and primal, instinctual panic violently breaking through his cold mask. The apex predator opened his mouth, perhaps to issue a harsh command, perhaps to demand she return to her designated place in the shadows. She simply opened her hand. The heavy silver ring plummeted. The sharp metallic clack of the jewelry hitting the hard granite echoed through the utterly silent hall like a deafening gunshot. The sound rippled outward, carrying a final, undeniable finality that struck the chest of every wolf in the room. The Luna had not just rejected the public humiliation. She had rejected the pack, the crown, and the mate who had so casually discarded her. Draven flinched physically, his broad shoulders jerking violently as if he had been struck by an unseen blade. A low, wounded sound, completely involuntary and entirely broken, tore from the back of his throat. He reached out a trembling hand toward the altar, his thick fingers shaking, the confident authority of the terrifying apex predator instantly unraveling before the entire pack. But Seren had already turned her back. She walked purposefully toward the heavy oak doors. She did not run. She moved with the slow, dignified tempo of a true queen leaving a ruined, doomed kingdom behind. The elite guards stationed at the exit were too stunned by the sheer audacity of her devastating silence to intervene. They simply stepped aside, lowering their silver-tipped spears, their eyes wide with profound shock. She pushed through the heavy timber, stepping gracefully over the threshold, and leaving the suffocating heat of the grand hall behind her forever. The bitter winter blizzard hit her the very moment the heavy doors swung shut, abruptly cutting off the chaotic, explosive uproar that finally erupted inside Stone Keep. The biting frost stung her pale cheeks, violently whipping her dark hair around her face. The misty woods of Arendor loomed before her, a dark, terrifying labyrinth of ancient pines and deep, treacherous snow. The cold was intense and unforgiving, numbing her exposed skin through the thin, decorative fabric of her ceremonial gown. Her delicate slippers crunched softly against the freshly fallen frost, each step taking her further from the political corruption and the man who had completely shattered her trust. She walked directly into the freezing tree line, the heavy white fog immediately swallowing her fragile silhouette. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. The signature thought drifted through her mind, not with crushing despair, but with a fierce, absolute clarity. The arrogant pack had thought her weak because she did not roar, because she did not bare her teeth. They did not understand that absolute silence was the ultimate weapon of survival. As the glowing lights of the capital faded behind the thick curtain of winter mist, the agonizing void in her chest began to shift. The dead, freezing sensation of the broken claiming mark was still there, an ugly scar on her soul, but deep within her core, beneath the profound trauma of the night, something else was waking up. A faint, glowing warmth stirred deep in her womb. It was not the standard silver magic of the wolves. It was a rich, molten golden heat, an ancestral cosmic resonance that belonged entirely to her hidden sunborn lineage. She wrapped her freezing arms protectively around her abdomen, feeling the tiny, powerful sparks of life, dynamically responding to her isolation. She was entirely alone in a dangerous world of teeth and winter frost, completely stripped of her royal titles, her resources, and her home. But as she vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, carrying the true royal heirs into the dark, Seren felt for the first time in years a fierce, undeniable sovereign power coursing through her veins. She would not die in this snow. She would build a prosperous sanctuary from the ashes, and she would never, ever look back. The physical severing of a fated mate bond was not a clean, merciful wound. It was a chronic, rotting decay that lived deep in the marrow of the bones, a creeping necrosis of the soul that ruthlessly punished the victim for surviving. The pregnant exile pushed southward, completely at the mercy of the bitter winter winds that relentlessly hunted her across the jagged northern territories. The biting frost violently whipped her dark hair, stinging her pale cheeks through the thin, torn velvet of her ceremonial gown. She walked until her delicate slippers wore completely through, until her corlused feet bled directly into the deep, unforgiving snow, and then she simply kept walking. Every night, beneath the frozen roots of ancient pines, violent tremors racked her exhausted frame. The phantom ache of the absent silver ring radiated up her left arm, a sickening, throbbing numbness that tried to convince her failing nervous system that it was already dead. It felt as though a hollow cavern of ice had been carved into her chest, chilling her lungs with every jagged breath. Whenever the freezing darkness threatened to pull her under, the dormant cosmic energy within her womb would pulse. A sudden, fierce surge of molten heat that aggressively fought back the cold, wrapping her internal organs in a desperate, protective fire. She learned to navigate by the pale moonlight, avoiding the wide hunting trails where Draven's elite trackers often patrolled. Sometimes she could hear the distant, hollow howls of the Arendor wolves carrying on the wind, a chilling reminder of the grand stone hall she had abandoned. They were searching for a broken, wolfless Omega to drag back for execution, but Seren was no longer weak. The relentless starvation and the brutal elements stripped away the fragile, obedient girl who had stood silently at the altar. In her place, a hardened survivor emerged, sustained entirely by the radiant golden warmth radiating from her swollen womb. For 6 grueling months, her silent, agonizing march dragged on across the frozen wastes until, finally, the oppressive grey frost broke. The treacherous, icy mountain pass gave way to a steep descending trail, and the atmospheric shift was so immediate it physically staggered her. The biting, knee-deep snow dissolved rapidly into a thick emerald carpet of vibrant, pulsing moss. The hostile, freezing gales softened abruptly into a heavy, fragrant breeze, carrying the intoxicating, life-giving scents of wild honeysuckle, damp earth, and blooming citrus. This was the legendary Suncrest Valley, It was a forgotten sovereign basin shielded by towering, impenetrable granite peaks, a place where the brutal, suffocating winter of the Alpha territories could never reach. She stumbled toward a rushing, crystal-clear river, her physical limits entirely shattered by the sudden, overwhelming envelopment of ambient warmth. Her knees hit the soft, damp riverbank with a heavy thud. The void in her chest, the cavernous, echoing emptiness left by the public betrayal at the altar, suddenly flared, completely overriding her exhausted nervous system. The edges of her vision turned a blinding, hazy white. She slumped forward into the fragrant moss, her body finally allowing itself to break. The world faded rapidly, the sound of the rushing water turning to static, but not before she registered the heavy, deliberate crunch of leather boots approaching her fallen form. When her eyes fluttered open again, the suffocating, terrifying heat of the massive capital hearth fires was completely gone. Instead, she was enveloped in a gentle, radiant warmth that seemed to hum against her very skin. She lay on a narrow cot in a rustic, beautifully crafted wooden cabin, covered in thick, woven wool blankets that smelled deeply of dried lavender and crushed mint. The quiet, rhythmic scrape of a stone mortar and pestle echoed from the far corner of the sunlit room. A man sat by an open window, bathed in the rich, heavy amber light of the valley's afternoon sun. Thomas Thorne did not look like an elite, arrogant pack elder. His weathered face was lined with decades of quiet, dignified solitude, and his thick, capable hands were heavily stained with the dark green sap of medicinal herbs. He set the heavy stone pestle aside with a soft clack and turned his fiercely observant gaze toward the cot. "Drink the tea on the wooden table," the exiled healer instructed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that held no alpha command, only absolute, pragmatic care. "It will stop the violent tremors in your nervous system. The chamomile is cut with sun blossom root to stabilize your core temperature." The pregnant woman pushed herself onto her trembling elbows, reaching for the clay mug. The scarred, dead tissue on her ring finger was starkly visible in the bright sunlight. She flinched, instinctively pulling her arm back to hide the proof of her discarded status, expecting his immediate disgust. Thomas merely shook his head, his expression softening into profound, agonizing empathy. "You do not need to hide your scars in this house," he murmured, gently reaching out to inspect the blackened, hollow mark on her wrist where the claiming bond had violently snapped. He traced the dead edges of the severed connection with a glowing, practiced fingertip. "The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power. It creates a void, an absence where your magic should be." She stared at him, her throat tight with a lifetime of enforced, obedient silence. "Why did you bring me inside?" she whispered, her voice rough and entirely unused to speaking her own mind without fear of punishment. "I am a rogue, a rejected Omega. I bring nothing but a severed bond and danger." The older man looked out the sunlit window, his jaw tightening with the heavy weight of old, buried memories. "It's because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me." He turned his attention back to her swollen abdomen, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sensed the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the energy pooling there. "Besides, you are not wolfless, and you are certainly not a defective creature. I have not felt the pure ancient resonance of the Sunborn lineage in over 40 years. You carry the cosmos in your blood, child." The simmering interlude of her exile began. Months bled into one another, completely insulated from the political corruption, the manipulative nobles, and the decaying magic of the northern territories. Seton Vantrell did not just survive in the Golden Valley. She fundamentally rebuilt her entire soul from the brutal ashes of her public humiliation. The quiet, repetitive domestic routine became her ultimate sanctuary. She spent her mornings kneeling in the rich, dark soil of the healer's expansive terraced gardens, cultivating rare sun blossoms, potent bloodroot, and sweet mountain berries. Her hands, once forced to pour honeyed wine for arrogant alphas who mocked her silence, grew beautifully, proudly collused from genuine, life-giving labor. She learned to mend her own clothes, to bake bread infused with the valley's sweet herbs, and to breathe without waiting for permission. She spent her afternoons studying the ancient leather-bound texts Thomas kept stacked by the stone hearth. From those fragile pages, she learned the truth about the Sunborn, as a sovereign lineage older than the wolf packs, gifted with the raw, elemental fire of the stars themselves. As her belly swelled with the immense weight of the royal heirs, the ancient magic in her blood physically manifested. At night, when the valley plunged into cool, quiet darkness, her veins would literally glow through her pale skin, a breathtaking network of brilliant, liquid gold that pulsed in perfect, rhythmic synchronization with the two rapid, tiny heartbeats inside her. The golden light was fiercely warm, deeply soothing, completely eradicating the lingering phantom chills of the broken mate bond. She was no longer a fragile, disposable vessel waiting to be shattered by a careless king. She was rapidly becoming a supreme, unyielding conductor of cosmic energy. Thomas watched her stunning transformation with quiet, protective pride, teaching her how to ground the overwhelming, erratic flares of solar magic into the deep earth so the raw power would not consume her fragile nervous system. During a particularly difficult, exhausting afternoon, when the agonizing physical pain of her heavily pregnant frame brought tears of absolute, helpless frustration to her eyes, the healer placed a steadying, warm hand on her trembling shoulder. He offered a piece of ancestral wisdom that he had carried through his own long, lonely exile. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my Seren. Smallness is a gift, use it." The mentor's quiet, earnest words anchored her racing panic, reminding her that being entirely overlooked by the arrogant elite was exactly what had allowed her true, devastating power to safely germinate in the dark. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. She could build an empire in the shadows without anyone noticing, the first stone being laid. The glorious culmination of her physical and emotional rebirth arrived exactly 1 year after her desperate flight from Arendor under the pale light of the winter solstice. The remote valley was insulated from the freezing blizzards raging outside its borders, but inside the small wooden cabin, the temperature spiked to impossible cosmic levels. The labor was overwhelming, surging through her with the ferocious, undeniable force of a hurricane chained inside a glass jar. She did not scream for the man who had abandoned her. She did not wish for the cold, unfeeling stone walls of the capital. She gripped the thick wooden bed frame until the timber literally cracked and splintered under her bare hands, her storm-grey eyes flashing into a blinding, incandescent gold as the ancient magic flared wildly to protect her. The moment the first piercing cry shattered the tense, suffocating silence of the room, a literal shockwave of molten golden light blasted through the cabin, throwing every shadow out the open windows. Aidan Blackwood was born first. He was a heavy, broad-shouldered infant who did not wail endlessly like a normal newborn. Instead, he opened his eyes almost immediately, staring up at his exhausted, weeping mother with an intense, heavy observance that was terrifyingly protective for a creature so impossibly small. A few agonizing minutes later, the second immense surge of cosmic magic swept through the quiet room. Clara Blackwood arrived with a fierce, lyrical cry that vibrated the very glass in the window panes. She was physically smaller than her brother, but her raw elemental presence was instantly undeniable, filling the small space with the sweet, highly charged ozone scent of a summer lightning storm. Seren held the twins against her warm, exhausted chest, her breathing ragged, shallow, and utterly triumphant. The physical sensation of their tiny, impossibly warm bodies resting against her skin completely, permanently filled the cavernous, aching void that had haunted her for nearly a year. The golden, radiant heat pouring from their small frames merged seamlessly with her own awakened, sunborn magic, creating a closed, perfect, unbreakable loop of absolute safety. She pressed her face into their soft, damp hair, weeping quietly. Not from pain and never from regret, but from the overwhelming, somatic realization that she had won. She had carried the true, undisputed future of the elemental shifters into the light, entirely on her own terms, without begging for a single scrap of validation from the monsters who had discarded her. The early years in the sunlit basin moved with a fierce, joyful, unstoppable momentum. The toddlers grew at the accelerated, terrifying pace of ancient apex shifter bloodlines. But Aiden and Clara were not merely standard wolves. They were a profound, unprecedented fusion of two absolute dominant lineages, carrying the brutal physical strength of the North and the divine, burning magic of the cosmos. Seren spent her days teaching them the quiet observation she had mastered in the shadows, while Thomas taught them the medicinal properties of every plant in the vast valley. They were safe, they were hidden, they were entirely loved. As they grew, the differences in their magic became starkly clear. Aiden moved with a heavy, deliberate, calculated strength, his very presence radiating an intense, simmering heat that could instantly melt the winter frost. His broad shoulders and serious demeanor mirrored the Alpha King, but his protective instinct was entirely his own. Clara was an unpredictable storm of joyous energy, her laughter sparking literal flashes of golden light that danced across the canopy leaves, her silver fur shining like captured starlight. Together, they were an unstoppable force of nature, entirely insulated from the political decay of Arendor. The absolute physical proof of their supreme nature manifested on a crisp, golden autumn morning when the twins were 5 years old. Seren was outside the cabin, peacefully hanging washed linen on a woven cord near the expansive garden, the gentle breeze carrying the rich scent of drying lavender. A sudden, sharp rustle in the tall, amber grass caught her attention. She turned, a soft smile on her lips, expecting to see the children chasing river frogs or wrestling in the dirt. Instead, her breath hitched violently in her throat, her calloused hands dropping the damp fabric directly to the soil. Standing near the edge of the dense tree line were two young, magnificent wolves. They were stunning, breathtaking creatures. Their thick, juvenile fur was the exact, unmistakable metallic silver of the royal Blackwood line, the undeniable, genetic stamp of the sovereign king she had left behind, but it was their eyes that commanded absolute, terrified reverence. Instead of the cold, merciless winter storm grey of their father, both wolves possessed eyes of burning, molten gold. As the young silver wolves bounded playfully through the tall grass toward her, small sparks of golden solar fire physically trailed from their massive paws, scorching the damp earth in tiny, brilliant bursts of pure cosmic magic. The undeniable proof of their sovereign birthright was written in fire across the valley floor. The boy wolf, Aiden, reached her first, pressing his heavy, silver head aggressively against her thigh in a mature gesture of absolute, unyielding protection. Clara trotted up a moment later, playfully nipping at her brother's ear before leaning her warm, heavy weight against her mother's other leg. The radiant, pulsing heat pouring off their fur was intoxicating, a physical manifestation of their perfect health and supreme, unrivaled power. The quiet Luna dropped to her knees in the damp moss, entirely uncaring of the dirt staining her simple linen dress. She wrapped her arms around the thick, silver necks of her children, burying her face deeply in their warm, sunlit fur. The scent of pine, ozone, and pure sunshine filled her lungs, completely erasing the last lingering ghost of the scent of gardenia that had haunted her nightmares. Hidden deep within the dense pine shadows of the tree line, Lead Tracker, Gregory Vance held his breath, his weathered hands trembling against the rough bark. He had spent years scouring the brutal northern territories on Draven's desperate orders, following rumors and faded scents on the freezing winds, but he had never expected this. The Arendor Pack's loyal tracker watched the 5-year-old silver-furred twins with wide, disbelieving eyes. They bore the unmistakable, undeniable royal shift of the Blackwood bloodline, yet they carried the ancient molten gold gaze of the Sunborn. The legendary true heirs were not only alive, but they were thriving in a sovereign sanctuary, completely untouched by the capital's rot. Realizing the sheer, world-shattering magnitude of his discovery, Gregory silently backed away into the heavy undergrowth, his mind racing as he turned north. He had to bring the news back to the dying Alpha King before it was too late. She looked up at the towering, sunlit peaks that shielded her thriving sanctuary from the rest of the dying, corrupt world. Her heart beat with a steady, sovereign rhythm. She thought of the cold, rotting keep in the north, of the manipulative rival who had stolen an empty crown, and of the terrifying apex predator who had thrown away his only salvation for a moment of political convenience. Thank you for letting me go. Because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. Seren was no longer a silent, defective Omega hiding in the terrifying shadows of a grand stone hall. She was the absolute, unquestioned queen of Suncrest Valley, the living vessel of the sun, and the fierce mother of the only true heirs the world had ever seen. And she knew, with the terrifying, unyielding certainty of a woman who had rebuilt her soul from absolute nothingness, that she would burn the entire continent to ash before she let anyone take them away. The winter in Arendor had not broken for 6 agonizing years. It was a suffocating atmospheric curse that gripped the jagged northern peaks in a permanent fist of grey ice. Without the living spiritual anchor of a true Luna, the ancestral soil had completely rejected its inhabitants. Pine forests bled black sap, their towering trunks rotting. Crops failed for 5 consecutive harvests, turning to diseased ash. The majestic Arendor wolves were starving. Their shifts had become erratic and incomplete, their massive frames hollowed out by the terrifying absence of the pack's divine connection. At the absolute center of this rotting empire sat Alpha King Draven Blackwood. He was an apex predator being devoured from the inside out. He sat motionless on the towering obsidian throne in the grand stone hall. The hearth fires were nothing more than sputtering embers, unable to banish the bone-deep chill. But the most excruciating cold radiated directly from his own flesh. The physical severing of the fated mate bond had manifested as a literal, creeping necrosis. Over the left side of his massive chest, perfectly centered over his struggling heart, the skin had turned a bruised, pitch-black hue. The dead tissue branched outward in jagged, toxic veins, tracing the pathways of a shattered soul. Every single breath he drew felt like inhaling pulverized glass. The agony was constant and entirely deserved. The heavy oak doors swung open, the rusted iron hinges shrieking. The cloying, aggressively sweet scent of gardenia immediately invaded the freezing room. Catherine Sterling marched down the center aisle. The 5 years since the disastrous Winter Solstice Gala had melted her triumphant, sickeningly sweet smile into a panicked grimace. The High Elders were now either dead from the famine or openly hostile, recognizing that the crown she wore was a powerless shell. She dragged a small figure by the hand, her manicured fingers digging into the child's fragile wrist. Liam Sterling was 6 years old. He was the child Draven had publicly declared as the sole, absolute future of the Arendor territory, and he was completely, undeniably human. The boy stumbled over his oversized royal garments, his pale face pinched with misery. He possessed none of the imposing bone density of the Blackwood lineage. His watery brown eyes lacked the terrifying winter storm grey of a royal shifter. Around his trembling neck hung the ancient royal heir tokens, heavy bone amulets that were literally bruising his delicate collarbones. Their immense spiritual weight was physically rejecting the weak vessel. "Stand up straight," Catherine hissed, jerking the whimpering child to face the throne. "Show the sovereign your strength." Draven slowly lifted his heavy head, the black rot creeping up his neck like a cold collar of iron as his heart fought against the decay. His gaze, once sharp and commanding, was now hollow and haunted. The boy was fragile, utterly incapable of surviving a single day in the brutal hierarchy of the pack. "Bring him to the altar," Draven commanded. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that tore at his ruined chest. She practically shoved the crying child up the grand stone steps, stopping before the massive slab of granite. This was the exact spot where Seren had stood, where she had dropped the silver ring before vanishing into the night. Draven pushed himself up, his massive frame shaking as the black necrosis protested the movement. He descended the steps, stopping just inches from the terrified boy. "Place your hands on the ancestral stone, Liam," Draven instructed quietly. "Call to the earth. Let the ancestors feel your wolf." Liam sobbed, pressing his small, pale palms against the freezing granite. Nothing happened. The stone remained dead, grey, and completely unresponsive. There was no flash of silver light. There was no low vibration of pack magic acknowledging its future king. There was only a weak human boy crying in a ruined hall. The reality of his colossal failure hit Draven like a physical blow. The Alpha King closed his eyes as a fresh wave of blinding agony ripped through the broken claiming mark over his heart. He had sacrificed his true fated mate for this. He had allowed corrupt nobility to convince him that Seren's silence was a terminal defect, handing his legacy over to a woman whose womb was devoid of any magical spark. The political convenience was a fatal lie. Draven reached out. His scarred hand moved with startling gentleness as he unclasped the heavy bone amulets from Liam's bruised neck. The boy gasped in immediate relief. "My king, please!" Catherine shrieked, her facade completely shattering. She threw herself forward to grab his arm. "He is your blood. He is the only heir. He is nothing," Draven whispered, his terrifying lethal tone freezing the air. "He has no wolf. He has no magic. And you, Catherine, have destroyed my kingdom with your lies." He turned his back on them, addressing his elite guards. "Strip her of her royal silks. Take the boy and the woman to the lower keep. They are banished from the grand hall. If I ever see her face in my presence again, I will execute her." The mistress's screams of fury echoed violently as the guards dragged her away, the heavy oak doors slamming shut. The sudden, absolute silence that rushed back into the grand hall was deafening. It was the exact same silence Seren had left behind, a damning judgment that had haunted Draven every night for 5 agonizing years. He was entirely alone, clutching the ancient bone amulets of a broken lineage, suffocating under the weight of his monstrous choices. The private royal chambers were even colder. Draven sat on the edge of the heavy bed, his massive shoulders trembling as another coughing fit racked his deteriorating frame. He stared blankly at the thick, black fluid staining his white linen cloth. The necrotic rot had spread past his pectoral muscle, creeping dangerously close to his throat. It was a slow, humiliating decay of a sovereign who had completely severed his own soul. His right hand slowly uncurled in his lap. Resting in his scarred palm was the sacred moon ring. For 5 years it had been his only anchor, permanently stained with a single dark smear of Seren's dried blood. The heavy silver band never warmed to his touch, a constant, physical reminder of the profound safety and warmth he had casually thrown away. He had thought her quiet nature was a flaw. He realized now that Seren's uncomplaining servitude, silently holding his immense temper in check, was the absolute pinnacle of sovereign strength. She had possessed a resilience that could weather any storm, and he had repaid her devotion with public humiliation. Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children, because monsters do not search for a year, because monsters do not look at me the way you do. He had been the monster, and now the monster was finally rotting away. A sharp knock broke his despair. Draven shoved the silver ring into his belt pouch, forcing his spine straight despite the tearing pain. Enter. Gregory Vance stepped into the freezing chambers. The older wolf looked exhausted, his thick grey fur mantle coated in biting frost. He had spent the last 5 years tracking every faint rumour on the winter winds. The relentless hunting in the lethal blizzards had aged him considerably, his face lined with profound defeat. "My king," Gregory murmured, bowing his head, "we have swept the Ironfall borders. We have searched the jagged caverns of the deep north. The territory is empty. There is no trace of the Luna." The phantom ache in Draven's chest flared into a searing, white-hot agony. "She is not dead," the Alpha King rasped, his voice vibrating with desperate certainty. "If she were dead, this rot in my chest would have killed me instantly. The bond is severed, but the anchor still exists. I can feel the absolute void where she belongs." Gregory hesitated, looking at the dark veins of necrosis. Alpha. To search further requires crossing the lethal southern peaks. The high-altitude frost claims even the strongest shifters. It is a suicide mission. Draven stood up, locking his knees to force his imposing frame to tower over Gregory. "Then you will walk into the suicide mission. The northern territories are ash. My false heir is a powerless human. This pack will not survive another winter without its true spiritual anchor. You will cross the southern peaks. You will search the forbidden valleys. I do not care if it takes you another 5 years. You will not return to this rotting keep until you have found my mate." Gregory swallowed hard, recognizing the terrifying finality in his Alpha's voice. The loyal wolf placed a fist over his heart and bowed deeply. "As you command, my king. I will find her, or I will let the frost claim me." He left the freezing chambers, leaving Draven alone with the agonizing throbbing of his dying heart. Months bled into one another. The brutal winter outside mirrored the relentless, accelerating decay within Draven's body. He spent his days sitting in the dark, clutching the blood-stained silver ring, praying to ancestors he had completely failed. The black necrosis fully colonized his chest, making every movement a torturous battle. He was fading like a candle running out of wax, an apexed predator reduced to a broken shell. Then, on a crisp, deeply frozen evening, the heavy oak doors of his chambers were violently thrown open. Draven jerked his head up. It was Gregory Vance. The scout was entirely out of breath, his winter furs torn and caked with dried mud. But it was not the physical exhaustion that made the Alpha King's heart suddenly seize. It was the scent, clinging thickly to Gregory's ruined cloak, overpowering the rotting stench of the capital, was the undeniable, intoxicating aroma of wild honeysuckle, damp summer earth, and blooming citrus. It was a scent of impossible radiant warmth. It was a scent of absolute, undeniable life. Gregory collapsed to his knees on the freezing stone floor, his weathered eyes wide with profound, world-shattering awe. "I crossed the southern peaks, my king," Gregory gasped, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "I found a hidden basin, a valley of pure, untouchable sunshine completely shielded from the frost." Draven could not breathe. The black veins in his chest burned with an searing heat. He staggered forward, dropping heavily to his knees directly in front of Gregory, grabbing his shoulders. "Seren," Draven choked out, the name tearing from his ruined throat. "Is she? She is alive." "Alpha," Gregory swore, tears freezing on his cheeks. "She is the absolute, unquestioned queen of a thriving, prosperous sanctuary. The land blooms beneath her feet. The exiled wolves worship the very ground she walks on." Draven let out a shattered, broken sob, his heavy head dropping in overwhelming relief. She was alive. She had built an empire. "But there is more, my king," Gregory whispered in terrified reverence. The loyal wolf gripped Draven's forearms to steady him. "She is not alone. I watched from the dense tree line. I saw 2 5-year-old wolves playing in the tall amber grass. They possess the absolute, undeniable metallic silver fur of the royal Blackwood line. But they do not have your winter storm eyes. Their eyes are burning, molten gold. They leave sparks of cosmic, solar fire wherever they step. They are the true, undisputed heirs of this continent, Alpha, and they are magnificent." The revelation shattered the last remaining fragments of Draven's cold, arrogant worldview. Seren had not just left him. She had vanished into the lethal winter, carrying the supreme, magical future of his entire lineage. Protecting them from a pack, that would have undoubtedly destroyed them. She had raised the legendary dual-element heirs entirely on her own, in absolute silence, while he had wasted away on a rotting throne with a powerless mistress. Draven Blackwood stared blindly at the freezing stone floor, the scent of honeysuckle and ozone filling his ruined lungs. A violent, desperate energy surged through his necrotic veins, overriding the agonizing physical decay. He was a dying, broken monster, but he finally knew exactly where the missing piece of his soul had gone. He was going to cross the lethal southern peaks. He was going to walk into the Valley of Gold, and he was going to fall to his knees before the queen he had discarded, even if the journey finally destroyed him. The transformation of Suncrest Valley did not happen through the brutal conquest of teeth and claws, nor through the terrifying, alpha-commanding roars that usually defined the shifting of territories. It bloomed in absolute dignified silence. Over the span of 6 years, the remote basin had evolved from a single, rustic wooden cabin into a sprawling, prosperous, sovereign sanctuary. The dense emerald canopy was permanently bathed in a rich, heavy amber light, completely insulated from the rotting, freezing atmospheric curse that was currently devouring the northern kingdoms. The intoxicating scents of wild honeysuckle, blooming citrus, and damp, sun-warmed earth hung thick in the air. At the heart of the thriving village stood Seren Vantrell. She was no longer the fragile, obedient Luna who had kept her head bowed while pouring honeyed wine for arrogant nobles. She wore practical, elegant garments woven from valley flax and soft leather, allowing her unrestricted movement. Resting against the pale skin of her collarbone, suspended on a braided cord, was the sunborn ember. The rare, ancient elemental crystal pulsed with a warm, gold-glowing resonance, perfectly matching the awakened cosmic magic humming deeply within her veins. The hollow, dead void on her left wrist, where the fated claiming mark had been violently severed, no longer ached with cavernous despair. Instead, it had been entirely eclipsed by the immense, radiant network of sovereign energy she now commanded. The valley had become a beacon. The legend of a golden queen who offered absolute shelter had drifted on the wind, drawing the broken, the discarded, and the wolfless from across the frozen continent. On this particular afternoon, a group of 7 starving, frost-bitten exiles stumbled down the steep southern trail. They collapsed at the edge of the vibrant moss, their emaciated bodies racked with violent tremors. They had crossed the lethal peaks, fully expecting to be turned away, executed or enslaved. Seren did not wait for them to beg. She walked forward with slow, dignified grace. Thomas Thorne, the elder healer who served as her most trusted advisor, followed closely behind, carrying heavy wool blankets and steaming clay mugs of chamomile and bloodroot tea. The leader of the exiles, a battered Omega with a scarred face and terrified, hollow eyes, instinctively cringed as the Golden Queen approached. He pressed his face into the dirt, entirely accustomed to the cruel, unyielding dominance of traditional rulers. "We have nothing to offer," he rasped, his voice trembling violently. "Our wolves are weak. Our magic is faded. We only ask for the lowest room in your outer camps." Seren knelt softly in the damp earth, entirely uncaring of the mud staining her practical linen hem. A stray strand of dark hair blew across her eyes, but she simply ignored it, reaching out her beautifully corlused hands to gently lift the broken man's chin. "There are no outer camps here," she murmured. Her voice carried a warm, soothing resonance that instantly settled the frantic panic in his chest. "There are no lowest rooms. You have survived the winter frost, and that is all the strength I require." She pressed her palm against his freezing chest. The sunborn ember at her throat flared with a sudden, brilliant light. A surge of pure, molten gold fire flowed from her fingertips, sinking directly into the exile's frozen marrow. It was not a burning, destructive heat. It was a profound, somatic warmth that aggressively chased the frost-cold chill out of his failing organs, mending his shattered nerves and wrapping his exhausted soul in absolute safety. The man gasped. tears spilling hot and fast down his weathered cheeks as the agonizing pain of 100 frozen nights vanished in an instant. He did not swear allegiance out of fear. He wept, pressing his forehead to the back of her hand, pledging his life, his loyalty, and his newly healed wolf to the sovereign vessel of the sun. As he spoke the ancient tongue of the pack vows, Seren felt a new, delicate thread of golden light weave into her core. She was building an empire, one quiet act of mending at a time. A short distance away, near the rushing, crystal-clear river, the true royal heirs were training. Seren stood up, her gaze shifting to her children, a profound, fierce maternal protectiveness swelling in her chest. Aidan and Clara Blackwood were 6 years old, yet they possessed the imposing physical presence and terrifying raw power of adult shifters. They were the undisputed future of the continent, a flawless fusion of brutal physical dominance and supreme elemental magic. Aidan moved with a heavy, calculated apex precision. He suddenly shifted, his form exploding into a massive, magnificent metallic silver wolf. The undeniable genetic stamp of the Arendor King was visible in the broad, terrifying line of his shoulders, but the boy's eyes were a burning, incandescent gold. As his heavy paws struck the soft earth, small shockwaves of solar fire rippled outward. Clara danced around him in her human form, her lyrical laughter ringing out as she effortlessly commanded the ambient light, weaving intricate, glowing shields of solid sunshine that playfully deflected her brother's physical lunges. They were safe. They were radiant. They were entirely untouched by the political rot, the manipulative mistresses, and the cold stone altars of their father's kingdom. Seren watched them with a quiet, triumphant smile. She remembered the night in the grand stone hall, the agonizing humiliation as Draven proudly raised a powerless, human infant before the entire pack, declaring him the sole future of the territory. The memory no longer held any sting. It was completely numb, a faded nightmare belonging to a girl who no longer existed. Draven's betrayal had ultimately been her greatest liberation. By casting her into the lethal blizzard, he had unwittingly handed her the entire world. She had raised the legendary white wolf twins without the toxic, suffocating influence of the noble class. Every time Aidan tilted his silver head with sharp, observant intelligence, and every time Clara fiercely defended a weaker pup in the village, Seren knew she had won the ultimate war. The monsters who had discarded her thought they had buried her in the snow. They did not realize she was a seed. Far to the north, buried beneath an endless, raging blizzard, the Alpha King was dying. But Draven Blackwood refused to simply expire on his rotting obsidian throne. The lethal southern peaks were considered impassable during the harsh winter months, a jagged, terrifying wall of sheer granite and vertical ice that claimed even the strongest shifters. Yet 2 figures carved a slow, agonizing path through the blinding whiteout. Draven pushed his massive, deteriorating frame forward, every single step demanding a horrific toll on his failing nervous system. The black, creeping necrosis of the severed mate bond had completely colonized his chest, wrapping his heart in a cold, suffocating iron grip. The physical punishment was beyond agonizing. His skin burned with a feverish, toxic heat, while his internal organs felt as though they were slowly freezing solid. Every jagged breath he pulled into his lungs tasted heavily of copper and ash. Lead tracker Gregory Vance trudged a few paces ahead, his thick grey fur mantle caked in solid ice. The older wolf paused, driving his walking staff deep into a snowdrift to anchor himself against the howling gale. "Alpha!" Gregory shouted over the deafening roar of the wind, his voice thick with exhaustion and genuine fear. "We must find shelter. The high-altitude frost will shatter your lungs. The rot is spreading too fast." Draven did not stop. He could not stop. He stumbled past the tracker, his winter storm eyes completely clouded with raw, blinding agony, focused solely on the distant, unseen valley. "Keep moving." Draven rasped, the sound tearing violently from his throat. "If I stop, my heart stops." But the mountain was completely unyielding. A sudden, ferocious gust of wind slammed into the ridge, carrying the sheer force of an avalanche. Draven's legs buckled. The terrifying apex predator collapsed heavily into the deep snow, his scarred hands clawing uselessly at the freezing ice. A violent coughing fit racked his broken body, spraying dark, blackened blood across the pristine white frost. His numb fingers fumbled weakly, struggling just to maintain a grip on his own heavy fur mantle. Gregory scrambled to his side, hauling the Alpha's heavy arm over his shoulder and dragging him toward a shallow, jagged ice cave carved into the cliff face. The small cavern offered a meager reprieve from the violently tearing wind, but the temperature was still lethal. Draven slumped against the frozen stone wall, his breathing horribly shallow, the dark veins of necrosis visibly throbbing against his pale neck. "Talk to me, Gregory," Draven commanded, his voice a desperately thin whisper. He reached a trembling hand into his heavy leather pouch, his thick fingers desperately curling around the sacred moon ring. The ancient silver band was freezing, a dead, unfeeling object that violently mocked his suffering. "Tell me about their strength. Tell me what they can do. Keep me conscious." Gregory crouched close, shivering violently as he looked upon the absolute ruin of his once invincible king. "Their power is beyond any shifter lineage, my king," the tracker began, his voice taking on a tone of profound, terrified reverence. "I watched the boy, Aiden, during his combat training. He does not just fight like a wolf, he commands the very earth. I watched him shift into a magnificent, massive silver wolf, perfectly mirroring your own stance, Alpha. But his eyes, they are not our grey. They burn like the molten core of a star." Draven closed his eyes, a sharp physical jolt of agonizing regret tearing through his dying heart. He had chosen a human boy. He had chosen the weak, powerless offspring of a corrupt mistress, blindly throwing away a divine, world-bending lineage. "The boy struck a solid granite boulder during his training," Gregory continued, his eyes wide with the memory. "The stone did not just shatter Alpha. It melted into glass. The golden solar fire trailing from his pores is devastating. And the girl, Clara, she is smaller, but her magic is purely elemental. I saw her weaving solid light, laughing as she summoned a shield of sunshine that deflected her brother's strikes. They are perfect, my king. They are the supreme, undisputed future, but they belong entirely to her." A low, wounded sound escaped Draven's throat, an animalistic noise of pure, absolute devastation. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that Seren was suffering. He had arrogantly believed that a rejected Omega would inevitably perish without his protection. He had assumed she was hiding in the shadows, terrified and alone, weeping over the loss of his grand stone hall. He had been so incredibly catastrophically wrong. She had not hidden, she had healed. She had stripped away his toxic, suffocating influence and built an absolute empire of quiet strength. She had raised his children to be living gods, while he had allowed his pack to rot into ash for a lie. The heavy, agonizing realization was far worse than the necrosis eating his chest. It was the absolute, undeniable truth of his own monstrous failure. Draven forced his eyes open. He looked down at the blood-stained silver ring in his hand. He had been a cruel, unfeeling tyrant who demanded submission from a woman who deserved worship. But as the image of the golden-eyed twins solidified in his feverish mind, a sudden, desperate surge of possessive, primal instinct violently overrode his physical decay. He could not die in this cave. He had to see them. He had to fall to his knees and beg the queen he had discarded to mend the world he had broken. She was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. "Help me up," Draven growled, the gravelly command, suddenly laced with a terrifying, feral determination. His massive hand gripped Gregory's shoulder with bruising, desperate strength. "We are finishing this trek." They pushed out of the ice cave, fighting the violent, tearing gales for another grueling 6 hours. The ascent was a blur of agonizing pain, slipping boots, and freezing blood, but finally, just as Draven felt his necrotic heart stuttering toward a complete stop, They breached the absolute summit of the southern peaks. The descent began, and the atmospheric shift was so incredibly violent, it physically staggered the dying king. Within a matter of minutes, the blinding whiteout dissolved into a thick, emerald canopy. The brutal, biting frost was abruptly replaced by a heavy, fragrant breeze that carried the undeniable, intoxicating scent of wild honeysuckle, damp earth, and blooming citrus. The sudden influx of warm air hit Draven's ruined lungs like a physical blow. He stumbled, his heavy boots crunching onto soft, vibrant moss instead of rigid ice. The void in his chest, the cavernous, echoing absence of the severed mate bond, suddenly reacted. The black, necrotic veins over his heart throbbed with a sharp, searing heat, recognizing the ambient, sovereign magic radiating through the very soil of the valley. It was her, the profound, overwhelming presence of Seren's awakened sunborn power completely saturated the environment, wrapping around Draven's broken body with a terrifying, absolute authority. He stood at the edge of a towering cliff, looking down into the sprawling sunlit Sad basin. Below him lay a prosperous, thriving sanctuary, a kingdom built on healing, light, and quiet resilience. It was infinitely more beautiful, more vibrant, and more powerful than the rotting stone fortress he had left behind. Draven Blackwood dropped heavily to his knees in the damp moss, his massive shoulders shaking violently as the sheer magnitude of his total defeat finally broke his spirit. He was not a sovereign arriving to reclaim his territory. He was a dying, broken beggar, finally arriving at the gates of a goddess he had thrown away. The descent from the jagged cliff edge to the lush, vibrant floor of the basin was an agonizing, humiliating march for the dying sovereign. Every heavy step Draven Blackwood took down the steep, moss-covered trail sent a violent, tearing shockwave through his ruined chest. The black necrosis, which had completely colonized the left side of his torso, pulsed with a toxic, erratic rhythm. It violently resisted the overwhelming ambient warmth of the sanctuary, his flesh aching for the bitter, unforgiving ice of Arendor that he had once proudly commanded. The thick, fragrant air, heavy with the scent of wild honeysuckle, sweet cedar, and damp, sun-warmed earth, felt entirely foreign in his ruined, rotting lungs. He was an apex predator of the freezing north, a creature forged in bitter frost and ruthless dominance. Yet here, in the golden, sovereign light of the valley, he was nothing more than a trespassing ghost. Gregory Vance walked closely beside his Alpha, his weathered hands hovering anxiously, ready to catch the massive man when his failing knees inevitably gave out. The lead tracker's eyes darted constantly, absorbing the impossible reality of the hidden kingdom they had stumbled into. As they reached the edge of the sprawling, prosperous settlement, the sheer magnitude of Seren's achievement struck Draven like a physical blow. The village was a breathtaking tapestry of finely woven timber homes, terraced gardens glowing with medicinal flora, and crystal-clear irrigation streams that reflected the endless blue sky above. It was not a camp of desperate, shivering survivors clinging to the shadows. It was a thriving, magnificent empire. Dozens of exiled wolves paused in their daily labors, turning their gazes toward the staggering intruders. These were the very individuals the Alpha had casually banished from his grand stone hall. The Omegas, the Elders, the injured, and the wolfless. They did not flee from the terrifying beast of Arendor. They did not bow their heads in submission or bare their throats. Instead, they stood tall, their eyes hard and entirely unafraid, forming a quiet, impenetrable wall of silent judgment as the rotting king dragged himself through their home. They were anchored by a magic far purer than the brutal pack dynamics he had relied on. In the absolute center of the valley, beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient, sunlit willow tree, stood the woman he had casually destroyed. Seren was kneeling in the rich soil, laughing softly as she guided her children's hands in planting a row of rare sun blossom roots. She wore practical, finely woven linen, her dark hair tumbling freely over her shoulders, entirely unburdened by the heavy, restrictive ceremonial velvets of his court. The sunborn ember resting against her collarbone pulsed with a steady, liquid gold light, perfectly matching the profound sovereign power that radiated from her very pores. She was radiant. She was absolute perfection. The cavernous, aching void in Draven's chest flared with a sudden searing heat, a desperate, somatic instinct, screaming that his salvation was finally within reach. His wolf whimpered, a pathetic, broken sound that scraped against the inside of his ribs. Draven's legs surrendered completely. The terrifying sovereign of the Northern Territories collapsed, his massive knees striking the soft, damp earth with a heavy thud. The quiet laughter beneath the willow tree ceased instantly. Seren slowly turned her head, her beautifully corlused hands still resting on the vibrant green leaves of the garden bed. Her storm-grey eyes, once so full of quiet devotion and fearful obedience, swept over his horrific, deteriorating frame. She took in the dark, blackened veins creeping up his neck, the hollowed-out cheeks, and the absolute ruin of his winter storm gaze. For a fraction of a second, the bustling valley went completely, terrifyingly silent. Every single breath hung suspended in the heavy amber light. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Queen's decree. Draven opened his mouth to speak, to demand her return, to invoke the ancient laws of the fated mate bond, but the words dissolved into a wet, violently broken sob. He pressed his forehead directly into the dirt, his broad shoulders shaking uncontrollably. The physical dam of his arrogant pride shattered, releasing 5 years of suffocating guilt, cosmic punishment, and blinding regret. He wept openly, the tears cutting fresh, clean tracks through the soot, sweat, and dried blood caking his pale face. The frost that had encased his heart for half a decade melted into agonizing, useless despair. A low, terrifying vibration suddenly rattled the earth beneath his hands. Before Seren could even rise from the soil, a massive, metallic, silver blur launched itself across the garden. Aidan Blackwood did not recognize the weeping, broken man as a father. The 6-year-old boy possessed the terrifying, instinctual intelligence of an apex predator, and all he perceived was a rotting, toxic threat encroaching upon his mother's sacred space. Mid-leap, the child's form exploded outward, shifting violently into a colossal silver wolf that easily rivaled the size of Draven's own elite guards. The juvenile beast landed squarely between the fallen king and the Golden Queen. Aidan's metallic fur bristled with lethal intent, his chest rumbling with a deafening, furious growl that vibrated the very air. As the wolf bared his razor-sharp teeth, his eyes flared into a blinding incandescent gold. Small, brilliant shockwaves of solar fire erupted from his heavy paws, instantly scorching the damp moss into smoking ash. A second later, a sharp, highly charged scent of ozone flooded the clearing. Clara stepped forward, her small, lyrical face set in a mask of fierce, unyielding concentration. She did not shift. Instead, she raised her small hands, her fingertips glowing with pure, molten cosmic energy. A solid, shimmering wall of blazing light violently materialized between Draven and his family, radiating a heat so intense it forced the dying king to flinch backward. The girl stood firmly beside her brother, her own golden eyes burning with absolute uncompromising rejection. They were magnificent. They were the flawless, undeniable future of his bloodline, carrying the legendary dual-element power of gold sunborn fire and the royal silver wolf shift, and they were looking at him as if he were a monster they intended to slaughter without a second thought. "Stand down, my loves," a calm, soothing voice murmured. Seren rose gracefully from the garden bed, wiping the dark soil from her hands. She stepped forward, her gentle touch instantly calming the furious silver wolf. Aidan's terrifying growl softened into a low, protective hum. Though he refused to break eye contact with the intruder, Clara let the blazing wall of light fade into a soft, ambient glow, retreating slightly to press her small back against her mother's leg. Seren stood over the kneeling, weeping king. She did not look angry. She did not look vengeful. She looked entirely, devastatingly indifferent. "Seren," Draven choked out, the name tearing at his ruined throat like swallowed glass. He reached out a trembling, heavily scarred hand, his blackened fingers desperately seeking the hem of her linen dress. "Please, I am broken. The territory is rotting into ash. The ancestors have abandoned us." "The ancestors did not abandon you, Draven," the Queen replied softly, her tone stripped of any emotional attachment. "You abandoned the earth. You chose a crown built on lies, and now you are suffocating under its weight." The Alpha King sobbed, his chest violently heaving as another coughing fit sprayed dark blood onto the vibrant moss. "I was blind," he pleaded, his voice cracking, completely devoid of his former terrifying dominance. "Catherine's child. He is human. He has no spark. I was a fool, manipulated by the High Elders, terrified of a silence I did not understand. I was wrong. I see it now. I see the truth. You are the only Luna. These are my true heirs." He fumbled weakly at his leather belt pouch, his trembling fingers finally extracting the object he had guarded for 5 agonizing years. He held up the sacred moon ring. The heavy silver band was permanently stained with the dried blood from the night she had violently ripped it off her finger. It was a pathetic, desperate offering. "Take it back," he begged, his winter storm eyes wide with raw, feral panic. "Return to Arendor. Take the obsidian throne. The pack will worship you. I will spend the rest of my miserable life on my knees at your feet. Just save my people. Save our bond." Seren looked down at the tarnished piece of jewelry. Once, the prospect of wearing that heavy silver ring had filled her with a quiet, profound pride. Now it looked exactly like what it was, a cold, dead chain belonging to a world of teeth and cruelty that she had fundamentally outgrown. The heavy silver felt entirely meaningless in the radiant warmth of her sunborn sanctuary. She did not reach for it. She simply shook her head, a soft, sad smile touching her lips. "There is no bond left to save, Draven," she murmured. Her words were gentle, yet they carried the absolute, unyielding finality of an executioner's blade. "The claiming mark on my wrist died the moment you raised another woman's child to the capital's altar. The void it left behind was agonizing, but it taught me how to breathe without waiting for your permission. It taught me that my magic was not a defect to be hidden, but a sun waiting to rise. I am dying without you," he gasped, his fingers curling inward as the ultimate rejection finally pierced his necrotic heart, freezing the very blood in his veins. "Then you will die," she answered, the truth ringing clear and absolute in the sunlit air. "I spent 3 years stitching your battle wounds, silencing my own soul to anchor your temper, and you threw me to the winter frost for political convenience. You do not get to return when the frost finally bites you back. I will not drag my children back into a rotting fortress built on the bones of the innocent." Draven stared up at her, the horrific realization settling heavily into his marrow. There would be no redemption. There would be no grand reunion where the abused mate foolishly embraced the monster who had broken her. The universe demanded payment for the public humiliation at the Winter Solstice Gala, and the price was his absolute destruction. He had come seeking a savior, but he had only found a sovereign judge who could see right through his fractured, desperate soul. "What about the pack?" he whispered, his head drooping in final, crushing defeat. "The pack made its choice," Seren stated firmly, stepping back as Thomas Thorne approached, the elder healer placing a steady, protective hand on her shoulder. "Those who wish to heal have already found their way to my valley. The rest will perish with the stones of your capital. I am Seren of the Sunborn lineage, queen of this sanctuary, and I owe you absolutely nothing." She looked at the broken man shivering in the dirt one last time. There was no hatred left in her heart, only a profound, vast peace. She had rebuilt her entire universe from the ashes he had carelessly discarded. "Thank you for letting me go," because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The quiet, devastating words hung in the fragrant breeze. Seren turned away, her practical linen dress sweeping gracefully over the moss. Aidan shifted back into his human form, his golden eyes flashing a final, lethal warning at the fallen intruder before he took his mother's hand. Clara walked securely on her other side, the little girl's lyrical laughter returning as she summoned a tiny, dancing spark of sunlight to chase a passing butterfly. They walked back toward the heart of the thriving village, perfectly insulated, perfectly safe, and entirely whole. Gregory Vance slowly stepped forward, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. The loyal tracker looked at the beautiful, radiant family vanishing into the golden canopy, and then looked down at his ruined king. He reached down, gripping Draven's heavy arm, and hauled the massive, trembling man back to his feet. The Alpha King did not resist. The silver ring slipped from his numb fingers, falling silently into the dirt, instantly forgotten and swallowed by the rich earth. It was left behind, a worthless relic of a kingdom that no longer mattered. Draven Blackwood was led back toward the treacherous, freezing mountain trail, a dead man walking. He would never see the Valley of Gold again. He would return to the rotting, collapsing ruins of Arendor, and he would finally succumb to the black necrosis eating his chest, entirely alone in the suffocating dark. His ultimate punishment was to live just long enough to remember the warmth he could never touch again. Behind them, the golden sanctuary continued to bloom. The ambient, sovereign magic of the valley flared with a brilliant, undeniable warmth, protecting the exiled, the broken, and the beautiful. Seren Vantrell stood on the porch of her wooden cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular strokes of fire and stardust. She wrapped her arms around her two magnificent children, breathing in the scent of wild honeysuckle and absolute freedom. The monsters had finally been silenced, and the true queen had rightfully inherited the earth.